Ladies and gentlemen, in this documentary, we pull back the curtain on one of the most feared outlaw gangs of the Wild West, the Dalton Gang. Before they were feared outlaws, the Dalton brothers were trusted enforcers of the law. In the late 1880s, Bob, Grat, and Emmett Dalton were sworn in as deputy U.S. Marshals, tasked with maintaining order in the rough and often lawless territories of the American West. This fact alone is one of the most surprising and ironic aspects of their story. The very men who would later rob trains and banks with brutal precision were once responsible for hunting down criminals, serving warrants, and escorting prisoners across dangerous terrain. Their early law enforcement careers were influenced by their older brother, Frank Dalton, who was widely respected as a deputy U.S. Marshal himself. Frank was known for his courage and dedication, and his untimely death in the line of duty had a profound impact on the rest of the family. Bob, Grat, and Emmett stepped into his shoes, perhaps out of respect, or perhaps to carry on the family legacy. For a time, they were seen as honorable men, young, brave, and capable of handling the rough justice of the frontier. But even during their tenure as marshals, cracks began to appear. Bob, in particular, grew restless. The pay was low, the work was dangerous, and corruption was everywhere. Rumors swirled that the Daltons had begun to misuse their positions, skimming off the top of confiscated goods, turning a blind eye to certain criminal operations, and even participating in small-time theft. As the financial struggles of ranch life and poor lawman salaries took their toll, especially in the volatile Oklahoma territory, the idea of crossing to the other side of the law may have started to seem less like a betrayal and more like a survival tactic. Their descent into outlaw life wasn't an overnight decision. It was a slow, creeping erosion of ideals. The Daltons weren't born criminals. They were molded by a harsh and unjust world, where even those upholding the law could be punished by poverty, corruption, and betrayal. Eventually, their sense of justice turned inward, and what started as minor misdeeds snowballed into full-blown criminal ambition. The heart of the Dalton gang's identity was a bond that ran deeper than loyalty to a cause. It was loyalty to blood. The gang was composed almost entirely of brothers, Bob, Emmett, Grat, and occasionally Bill Dalton. Unlike many outlaw gangs of the time, who were thrown together by opportunity or necessity, the Daltons were united by shared childhoods, hardships, and a sense of family obligation that shaped every decision they made. They grew up in a large family of 15 children in Belton, Missouri, later moving to the Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. Life on the frontier was far from easy. The Daltons, like many families of their time, were no strangers to poverty, hardship, and the daily struggle to survive. Their father, Lewis Dalton, was a saloon keeper, while their mother, Adeline, worked tirelessly to raise her children in an unforgiving land where justice was often harsh and inconsistent. This upbringing forged a tight bond between the Dalton siblings, one built on trust, protection, and mutual dependence. As young men, the brothers worked together on ranches and in law enforcement. Bob and Grat were especially close, with Bob often acting as the de facto leader and strategist of the group. Emmett, the youngest of the three most active members, looked up to his older brothers and followed them with unwavering loyalty, even when that path turned criminal. Bill, the older brother who joined later, was not always involved in their crimes, but his influence and presence were felt. He would go on to form his own gang after the downfall of the original Daltons, proof that the outlaw spirit remained tied to the family's legacy. This deep sense of brotherhood is what made the Dalton gang so dangerous and so tragic. They operated with a level of coordination and trust that few gangs could match. There were no spies among them, no fear of betrayal. Their unity allowed them to plan and execute daring robberies, sometimes in broad daylight, with the confidence that only comes from complete faith in one another. To challenge one Dalton was to challenge them all, and that solidarity gave them a psychological edge over lawmen and civilians alike. But it also meant that when they fell together. Their final heist in Coffeyville, Kansas, wasn't just a criminal venture. It was a family operation. They entered the town side by side, prepared to risk everything, believing that their blood bond could carry them through even the most dangerous mission. Once the Dalton brothers crossed the line from lawmen to outlaws, they didn't settle for petty theft or small-town crime. They went big, targeting the lifelines of the American economy, trains and banks. These weren't random or desperate acts. They were calculated, coordinated strikes designed to seize as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, and then disappear into the vast wilderness of the American frontier. In the late 19th century, railroads symbolized the pulse of progress and wealth. Trains transported not only passengers, but large sums of cash, payrolls, and gold shipments across vast, sparsely populated lands. Banks, too, represented opportunity, not just for the communities they served, but for criminals willing to risk everything for a quick fortune. For the Daltons, this meant one thing: high stakes, high reward. Their first major crime was a train robbery near Alila, California, in 1891. It didn't go smoothly. Grat was arrested shortly afterward, but the experience gave the gang a taste for bold action. Bob and Emmett quickly escalated their operations, learning from past mistakes, scouting rail lines and bank locations, and assembling trusted riders to assist in their raids. Unlike some gangs of the era who struck only when opportunity presented itself, the Daltons plotted their heists with military-like precision. Train robberies became their specialty. They would stop trains in remote areas, hold passengers and conductors at gunpoint, and blow open safes using dynamite, often with brutal force. One of their most notorious train jobs occurred in May 1892 near Red Rock, Oklahoma. There, they looted the express car, fired into the air to terrify onlookers, and vanished before authorities could mount a response. These robberies captured headlines and fueled public fear. Newspapers described the Daltons as ruthless and efficient, a gang that struck like lightning and left chaos in its wake. But it wasn't just about trains. Banks, the symbols of establishment wealth, also fell into their sights. Their robberies were fast, violent, and theatrical. Men charging into towns on horseback, covering their faces with bandanas, barking orders, and blasting through vaults. They understood that speed and shock were their best weapons. The mere rumor of a Dalton gang sighting was enough to send townspeople and lawmen into a panic. As the gang's crimes grew bolder, so did their notoriety. Their names became synonymous with danger. Posters offering rewards for their capture were nailed to saloon doors and sheriff's boards across the territories. The Pinkerton Detective Agency tracked their movements. The U.S. Marshals, the very institution the brothers once served, now hunted them relentlessly. Robbing trains and banks wasn't just a tactic. It was their signature, their rebellion against a system they felt had failed them. These heists weren't random acts of desperation, but calculated statements. They were fast, furious, and designed to strike terror into the heart of a nation already struggling to tame its western frontier. Contrary to the chaotic image often painted by dime novels or cartoonish portrayals in comics like Lucky Luke, the Dalton gang were not reckless thugs charging blindly into danger. Their criminal operations were built on strategy, timing, and an intimate knowledge of the land, the railways, and human behavior. Every major heist they pulled off was preceded by careful surveillance, meticulous route planning, and precise coordination, hallmarks of a gang that treated crime like a profession. Bob Dalton, the de facto leader of the gang, was the mastermind behind many of their plans. With experience as both a lawman and an outlaw, Bob understood the legal system, the response times of marshals, and the weaknesses in the communication infrastructure of the time. He knew that if they could hit fast and vanish before word could travel to the next town, they could stay one step ahead of the law. Bob would often scout locations himself, posing as a traveler or rancher, studying the layout of banks, watching train schedules, and even noting the habits of local law enforcement. Each member of the gang had a role. Emmett, Grat, and the occasional outside recruits were drilled in what to do and when to do it. They rehearsed their attacks, selected horses known for speed and endurance, and chose escape routes that threaded through rugged, barely passable terrain, areas they knew intimately from years of living on the frontier. In some cases, they even planned backup routes in case something went wrong, stashing supplies or weapons along their path. This level of forethought set them apart from many of their contemporaries. Timing was everything. They often struck at twilight or just before dawn, using the cover of low light to approach unnoticed. When robbing trains, they timed their ambushes at isolated stretches of track where law enforcement was unlikely to be nearby. They selected areas with thick woods, riverbeds, or canyons nearby, ideal for fast getaways and hiding tracks. And when it came to banks, they chose days when cash shipments had just arrived, ensuring a bigger haul and more attention. Their precision even extended to psychological tactics. The Daltons understood the power of fear. During heists, they yelled commands with authority, moved swiftly through buildings, and fired warning shots, all designed to confuse, terrify, and suppress any attempt at resistance. Civilians, overwhelmed by the sudden violence and well-rehearsed motions of the gang, usually complied. Bank tellers and train conductors had no time to resist. The Dalton gang's ability to plan and execute such daring crimes in an era without modern communication or transport speaks to their intelligence, discipline, and ruthlessness. They weren't improvising. They were running carefully calculated operations, balancing danger with reward, and using every skill they had acquired as former lawmen and frontier survivors. The morning of October 5, 1892, was supposed to mark the pinnacle of the Dalton gang's criminal career, their boldest and most profitable heist yet. But instead, it would become the scene of one of the bloodiest shootouts in Old West history. The small town of Coffeyville, Kansas, would forever be etched into the annals of outlaw folklore as the place where the Dalton legacy came to a violent and tragic end. What made the Coffeyville job so audacious was its scope. The plan was to rob two banks simultaneously, located just blocks apart in the town center. Bob Dalton, driven by ambition and a desire to outdo Jesse James, the most infamous outlaw of the time, believed that pulling off a double bank robbery in broad daylight would cement the gang's place in history. The gang had everything planned. They would strike fast, collect the money, and escape through the nearby alley where horses were tied and waiting. But from the very beginning, things went wrong. Coffeyville wasn't like the isolated towns the Daltons had targeted before. It was a tight-knit, frontier community where people knew each other and recognized strangers. As soon as the Dalton brothers and their accomplices, Dick Broadwell and Bill Power, rode into town wearing fake beards and trying to disguise themselves, townsfolk grew suspicious. Some even whispered that the riders looked like the Daltons themselves. Their photos had been plastered on wanted posters across the region. As the gang split into two groups and entered the C.M. Condon and Company Bank and the First National Bank, word quickly spread. The townspeople, many of them Civil War veterans and well-armed storekeepers, sprang into action. In a matter of minutes, shopkeepers, clerks, and even the local barber grabbed rifles, shotguns, and pistols, setting up a makeshift ambush. The law wasn't coming. The town would defend itself. The firefight that erupted was brutal and unrelenting. Bullets flew in every direction. One of the robbers was shot before even making it out of the bank. The others, caught in a deadly crossfire as they tried to flee down the alley, were struck multiple times. The gang's horses had been moved or killed in the chaos, leaving them exposed and desperate. Bob and Grat Dalton were gunned down in the street. Bill Power and Dick Broadwell also died of their wounds. Emmett Dalton, though shot an astonishing 23 times, somehow survived, barely. But the cost wasn't one-sided. For brave Coffeyville citizens lost their lives defending their town. The streets were littered with bodies, broken glass, and spent ammunition. Smoke hung in the air, and the town, now eerily quiet, had become a battlefield. News of the failed robbery and shootout spread rapidly across the country. Headlines hailed the bravery of Coffeyville's citizens and marveled at the downfall of a gang that had once seemed untouchable. The Coffeyville Massacre, as it came to be known, wasn't just the end of the Dalton gang. It was the closing chapter of the myth they had built through years of fear, violence, and legend. Amid the thunderous gunfire and bloody chaos of the Coffeyville shootout, it seemed certain that none of the Dalton gang would escape alive. Indeed, 4 of the 5 outlaws fell that day. Their lifeless bodies sprawled across the dusty Kansas street, a grim end to their notorious reign. But from the storm of bullets, one man miraculously lived. Emmett Dalton, the youngest of the gang, just 21 years old. Struck by 23 bullets, Emmett's survival bordered on the miraculous. He was riddled with wounds to his arms, back, and torso. His chances of living were slim, and for several days, townspeople and lawmen expected him to die from blood loss or infection. Yet somehow he pulled through. Toughness, youth, and perhaps the stubborn will to live kept him breathing. Once it became clear he would survive, Emmett was shackled to a hospital bed, charged, and eventually sentenced to life in prison for his role in the robbery and the deaths of four Coffeyville citizens. He was sent to the Kansas State Penitentiary at Lansing, and there he remained for 14 long years. During his time in prison, Emmett had ample opportunity to reflect on the choices that had led him from a humble frontier upbringing to one of the most infamous criminal gangs in American history. Unlike his brothers, Emmett had lived to bear the weight of their shared legacy. He was no longer just a bandit. He was a living relic of the Wild West's most dramatic final chapter. But Emmett didn't waste his survival. Upon his release in 1907, thanks to a pardon, he did something few outlaws ever get to do. He reshaped his identity. He settled in Southern California, got married, and started over. But he also recognized that the public remained fascinated by the story of the Daltons, and he alone had the right to tell it. No one else had seen what he had seen. No one else had lived it. In the years that followed, Emmett published books recounting the Dalton gang's exploits, most notably When the Daltons Rode, co-authored with Jack Youngmeyer in 1931. It was a sensational blend of personal memory, legend, and frontier philosophy. Emmett didn't shy away from the gang's crimes, but he also painted a picture of young men driven by circumstance, pressure, and ambition, not pure evil. He portrayed the Daltons as flawed, rebellious souls shaped by a violent time, rather than cold-hearted killers. His story resonated. America was changing fast, and the tales of the Old West, with its dusty towns, horse chases, and six-shooters, were already fading into myth. Emmett's voice brought that fading world back to life. His account helped shape the cultural memory of the Wild West, contributing not only to historical records but to film and popular fiction. Hollywood eventually adapted When the Daltons Rode into a movie in 1940, with Emmett serving as a consultant. In doing so, he ensured that his brothers, and his version of their story, would live on in the American imagination. Though the Dalton gang's reign of terror was short-lived, spanning barely 2 years, their story has echoed through the decades like a gunshot in the canyonlands of American history. What began as a string of calculated robberies ended in a blaze of bullets and bloodshed, but the legend of the Daltons did not die in Coffeyville. If anything, it began there. Over time, their tale grew larger than life, blending fact with folklore, until the real men behind the guns became figures of myth, remembered not just for what they did, but for what they came to represent. In the early 20th century, America began to romanticize the Old West. The once brutal world of outlaw gangs and lawmen was reimagined through novels, dime store westerns, and later, motion pictures. The Daltons, young, daring, and tragically destroyed in their prime, fit perfectly into this narrative of doomed anti-heroes. Writers and filmmakers painted them as symbols of rebellion and frontier justice gone awry. They were cast as tragic figures who strayed from the path of righteousness and paid the ultimate price. Emmett Dalton's personal memoirs helped shape this legacy. His insider perspective gave the public a glimpse into the emotions, fears, and motivations behind the gang's actions, and allowed people to see them as more than just criminals. His stories were not only about robberies and shootouts, but about family, choices, regret, and survival. This nuanced portrayal allowed later generations to explore the Daltons as complex human beings rather than one-dimensional villains. The gang's legacy also flourished in Europe, particularly in France and Belgium, thanks to the wildly popular Lucky Luke comic series. There, the Dalton brothers were reborn as bumbling, exaggerated cartoon characters: Joe, Jack, William, and Averill. Though loosely inspired by the real gang, these fictional Daltons took on a life of their own, introducing generations of readers to a light-hearted parody of the Wild West's outlaws. While these versions bore little resemblance to the historical brothers, they ensured that the Dalton name remained familiar across the world. In museums and reenactments, their memory is kept alive. Tourists flock to Coffeyville to walk the same streets where the gang met its end, visit the death alley where they fell, and learn about the ordinary townspeople who stood up against them. History buffs debate the reasons behind the brothers' descent into crime. Was it a lust for fame, frustration with a broken system, or just the thrill of the outlaw life? Scholars continue to explore their lives, dissecting the historical records and comparing them with the legends that have grown around them. The Dalton gang's story, dramatic, violent, and human, became a cornerstone in the larger saga of the American frontier. It captures a time when justice was carried in a holster, when loyalty among brothers could lead to glory or ruin, and when the line between lawman and outlaw was as thin as a trigger pull. Their tale still resonates, not only for its action and tragedy, but because it reminds us how easily men can be shaped by the era they live in, and how legends are born not only in what people did, but in how we choose to remember them. And so, the story of the Dalton gang ends not with glory, but with gunfire, blood, and shattered dreams in the dusty streets of Coffeyville. What began as a family of lawmen became a brotherhood of bandits, bold enough to defy the law, yet not immune to its final judgment. Their tale is a reflection of the Wild West itself, unpredictable, dangerous, and filled with contradictions. Heroes became villains, lawmen became outlaws, and in the end, it was not the size of their guns or the number of robberies that defined them, but the legacy they left behind, one that still echoes through history books, campfire stories, and pop culture more than a century later. The Dalton gang may have died with their boots on, but their legend rides on, forever etched into the myth of the American frontier.